Hi there. This is one of a series of revision tutorial videos on unemployment. And in this session, we're going to focus on a discussion about some of the policies that might be most effective in cutting unemployment below current levels in the UK. Some of the policies, of course, might have applications to other economies too. So if you're studying the international economy generally, hopefully there'll be some useful ideas here. Let's start with an international perspective. This chart shows the highest unemployment amongst European Union countries. There are 28 in those countries. This is just the highest unemployment in May 2015. And you can see that some countries such as Greece and Spain have huge rates of unemployment, although that is starting to fall slowly. But crucially, the euro area as a whole, that's 19 countries who share the common currency, has an unemployment rate of over 10%. And even across the European Union, the 28 nations of the EU, unemployment is still very high. So there's clearly a big policy challenge facing governments and the European Union generally to get unemployment down from high rates. In the UK, the picture is slightly more positive in the sense that the unemployment rate, which is measured as a percentage of the labour force, has been falling quite sharply since the summer of 2012. It peaked at about 8.5% then, and is now heading back down towards about 5% of the labour force. So the issue is really what policies are likely to be most effective in getting unemployment down still further, and of course crucially in keeping unemployment low. Well, how to best to reduce unemployment? This depends crucially on the cause, and it's generally thought that a combination of demand side and supply side policies is needed, because of course there are different causes of unemployment. Let's take a quick look at the March 2016 budget, the first budget under the new Conservative government. They introduced a number of policies which you could argue are designed to support the progress in reducing unemployment. The main corporation tax rate, currently 20%, that's due to fall to 17% by 2020. The government's also increased the threshold, the point at which people start to pay 40% marginal income tax. That's going to go up to £45,000 from April 2017. The government's also introduced an annual threshold for 100% tax relief on local authority business rates for small firms. And crucially, from our perspective, the government is likely to give the go-ahead for major infrastructure projects such as Crossrail 2 in London, that's the North-South Crossrail, and the high-speed 3 link between Manchester and Leeds, which is part of the Northern Powerhouse project. Another policy, perhaps to improve geographical mobility of labour, is that the tolls on the 7 river crossings between England and Wales will be halved from their current levels by 2018. So oftentimes in budgets there are some policies introduced which can have, at least in the medium term perhaps, some impact on unemployment. So we're going to focus on a range of policy options, and in particular we're going to look at policies designed at increasing labour demand. That's going to be this slide. And then we'll look at some policies designed to improve the labour supply and get more people who are willing and able to find paid work. So let's think about policies to reduce unemployment which focus on the demand side of the labour market. We've mentioned in the past that cyclical unemployment is caused by a lack of aggregate demand. And the obvious solution would be policies designed to increase AD, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right in the standard AD-AS diagram. You'd hope, of course, that this wouldn't be caused by a rise in inflation, but keep in mind that unemployment, when it's high, means the economy has plenty of spare capacity. So it's possible to use standard macro stimulus policies. For example, the central bank may continue their policy of very low interest rates, allied to a policy such as quantitative easing, and they may also try to introduce measures to increase the supply of credit to businesses, particularly businesses who need the loan finance to grow and take on more workers. Another macro stimulus policy could be to try and engineer a depreciation in the exchange rate. A fall in the pound, for example, against the dollar or the euro would make British exporters of goods and services more competitive in overseas markets. But keep in mind there that the UK operates a floating exchange rate system, and the Bank of England does not seek deliberately to manipulate the value of the exchange rate. Fiscal policy can also be used from a macro stimulus perspective, and we're becoming increasingly interested in the National Infrastructure Plan in the UK, that is fast forwarding some infrastructure capital projects such as new housing, flood defence schemes, Second Forth Road Bridge in Scotland, the London Super Sewer, Crossrail 1 and Crossrail 2. There's a whole series of infrastructure projects, including increasing the funding for new motorways and bypasses, which in theory could be quite a stimulus to labour demand. The key to all of these policies, of course, is to think about the effectiveness of demand-side policies. So, for example, to what extent would £5 billion spent on new housing be a long-term increase in employment in the economy? Well, that depends on the size of the fiscal multiplier effect, and of course that's open to question. There's a separate topic video on our YouTube channel on the multiplier. Another way that you can increase or expand the demand for labour is by cutting the cost to businesses of taking on extra workers. So, for example, the government has introduced a fall in national insurance contributions paid by employers who take on long-term unemployed workers. And that strikes me as being a sensible policy because it reduces the marginal cost of adding somebody to a company's payroll. The government might also provide some subsidy or tax breaks for apprenticeship schemes and paid internships. The youth contract, for example, attempted to guarantee at least the availability of apprenticeships for people leaving school at 17. And increasingly, again, the government is thinking about funding regional policy more generously, creating special employment zones or special areas which offer tax relief for inward investment. So the second strand here is to make it cheaper to employ extra workers through tax relief or subsidy. And generally, on the demand side, policies might aim to make the economy as a whole more competitive. So, for example, the government has cut corporation tax, and that's designed to increase both domestic investment and also perhaps attract some inward foreign direct investment. Governments offer some tax incentives for research and innovation, for example through the Patent Box initiative. That cuts the corporation tax rate on the profits of patented products. And there's been a whole series of enterprise policies designed to encourage and hopefully nurture the growth of business startups. So it's important to focus on competitiveness policies, and again we have a separate YouTube video on that. Just type in competitiveness in the search engine and you can see how these policies might, in theory, add to labour demand. The second approach is to think about the supply side of weaknesses in the labour market and the policies that might be needed. The key to this really is to address immobility and disincentives. First of all, let's focus on occupational immobility. It's clear that the labour market we live in is fast changing because the world is changing very quickly. So it's important to provide funding for and increase the quality of workplace training. That will be important, particularly in giving people the new skills they need. There's great emphasis, for example, at the moment on teaching young people how to code. That would be a bonus in terms of increasing the labour supply available to our digital industries, including, for example, computer gaming and all sorts of other creative businesses. It's important for students in a global economy to have more than one language at their disposal. And clearly, apprenticeships and internships, if they're of sufficient quality, can improve the human capital of the labour force. A second approach is to address geographical immobility of labour. Oftentimes, it's literally the cost of getting to and from work that's a barrier to taking a job. Or people simply cannot afford to move to a new area because of the extremely high cost of housing, both buying and renting. So, for example, the government may decide to increase house building or try to incentivise private sector house builders to increase the housing stock. In theory, for a given level of demand, that should help to keep property prices lower and also encourage more affordable rents for people who are moving around across the country. A really important point is that we have to improve our transport infrastructure, both the reliability and the speed of the infrastructure and also the cost to people using it. And another issue to do with labour supply is really to address the question of incentives, or put another way, disincentives to work. So, for example, the extent to which a higher minimum wage, rebranded by Osborne perhaps unfairly as a living wage, the extent to which a higher minimum wage helps to make work pay and gets more people into paid work. There's a big debate about whether a minimum wage creates more unemployment or actually helps people back into work, but we'll leave that for a separate topic video. The government's increased the tax-free allowance to £11,500 from 2016. So this allows people who find work to earn more before they become eligible to pay the 20% basic rate of income tax. We wait to see how that affects work incentives in the labour market. And more recently, the government's introduced a welfare cap and other reforms designed to make it harder to claim benefit, but also to limit the amount of benefit in total that a family can claim. And the aim of that is laudable, although controversial in terms of how it's done. The aim of that is to make sure that those people in work, for example on average earnings, earn more than a family, for example, that's wholly dependent on benefits. So this slide is really all about attempting to address immobility of labour and the incentives to find work. It's important when you write about unemployment not to fall into the trap of saying that many people don't want to work. Okay, for the vast majority of people in this country, they are better off in work than being on benefits. One of the big issues in the labour market at the moment is youth unemployment. This chart shows the number of young people who are not in education, not in a job, or not in training, the so-called NEETs. And these people essentially are outsiders in the labour market. Many of them want to work, but they don't necessarily have the educational qualifications or the skills to find work. So a key area for policy intervention has been to address the employment opportunities and the training offered for NEETs. There's been a marginal success in bringing down the number of people who are NEETs, not in education, employment or training. But as you can see, there's a huge amount left to do. So overall, what are the key barriers? What are the key problems or hurdles that we have to overcome if we want to get unemployment down to, let's say, 5% and even better, below 4% over the next 2 years? I think the point that I would make to start with is that much of the unemployment that's left in the UK 6 years after the last recession is structural rather than cyclical. And structural unemployment, by its definition, is much harder to reduce than cyclical unemployment. There are lots of disincentives to work in the UK labour market. Our welfare, benefits and our tax system is incredibly complex, and millions of people fail to understand it properly. Our housing sector is by and large unaffordable, both to buy and to rent. People starting out in the labour market for the first time often cannot afford to leave home, such are the levels of house prices and average rents in our main cities. Another issue, which is creating disincentives, is that many of the new jobs are fairly poorly paid and offer low levels of job security. For example, the increase in zero-hours contracts. Low-paid jobs are jobs, but you have to work many hours per week to avoid relative poverty. And a major problem in the UK is that quality childcare, the availability of it and the cost does act as a barrier. In some regions, public sector dependency remains high and the private sector isn't as strong as perhaps it could be. And even those people who have a job, there's about 3 million people in the UK who are, according to surveys, underemployed. They have a part-time job, but actually they'd prefer a full-time job. The education system in this country is divided. There are big, huge structural variations in educational outcomes and opportunities. That needs to be addressed. And getting unemployment down does depend on our major export markets growing more quickly. As we know, there have been big problems in the European Union. So I see these as some of the big barriers to getting unemployment down, below, for example, 4%. So just to finish with, here's my overview about how we can get unemployment down below the current rate of 5% and hopefully to 4% or less. Getting unemployment down requires the economy to grow, not just in 1 year, but over several years. So macro policies which reduce the volatility of the economy will certainly help. To get unemployment down, we need a more balanced economic growth. We need balance between and within the regions. so that there are appropriate employment and job opportunities across the economy. It's massively important that we need policies to make work pay and investment in education pay. That's really important when one thinks about the cost of tuition fees and the cost of retraining. We need jobs that make work pay. A flexible labour market also helps, and Britain has one of the most flexible labour markets in the Western world. We've seen that by the fact that unemployment went up in the recession, but only to 8.5% and started to fall quite quickly. So we need to develop our flexibility, and that includes improving occupational and geographical mobility. The labour market in the world is changing rapidly. There are jobs out there in 5 years' time that don't yet exist. So how do we skill and how do we educate people to be able to take those jobs? That's a major supply side challenge. The final point goes back to what I said at the start of this revision presentation, that the way to reduce unemployment depends fundamentally on what the cause is. If the cause is cyclical unemployment, you focus on demand side approaches. If the cause is frictional or structural unemployment, you tend to focus on supply side measures aimed at increasing the supply of labour and ensuring as best you can that as many of those people who are eligible to work are actually able to work and work effectively and work at a wage which makes their job pay. So this has been a look at some of the key policies to reduce unemployment. Hope you found it useful, and check out some of the other unemployment videos on our Tutor2You YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me. Catch you again sometime soon.